All right. So, good evening. My name is Jo Burke. I am the program director for the NIU Art Museum. I want to welcome those of you who are here in person, especially, as well as any who join us later online viewing this. Tonight's presentation is one in a series developed by our former coordinator of marketing and education, Stuart Henn, in conjunction with the Refuge and Refugee exhibition currently on view at the museum, along with The Art of Surviving, the Journey of the Karen Refugees in Illinois, both running through November 12th. The exhibitions and programs of the NIU Art Museum are sponsored in part by the Illinois Arts Council Agency, the Friends of the NIU Art Museum, the NIU Arts and Culture Fee, and the College of Visual and Performing Arts season presenting sponsor, Shaw Media. I have the honor of introducing our guest lecturer this evening, Professor Abu Ba of the Northern Illinois University Department of Sociology. Professor Ba has 2 decades of extensive research and publishing experience on African and international security and governance issues. He is the editor-in-chief of African Conflict and Peacebuilding Review and the African editor of Critical Sociology. He is the recipient of several grants from the Carnegie Foundation Institute of International Education and has been awarded the Outstanding International Educator Award and the Lillian Cobb Award for Achievement in Global Education and Service here at NIU. His own education is from the University of Sofia in Bulgaria and the New School for Social Research in New York. His topic tonight, New Humanitarianism, Wars, State Building, and Globalism, addresses several key questions. What are the roots of civil wars and terrorism warfare? What are the interconnections between state security and human security? How do countries and world powers respond to security challenges and the responsibility to protect vulnerable populations? How does the politics of nativism challenge global society? Please join me in welcoming Professor Abu Ba.
Thank you very much, John. Thank you, everybody here and also online. It's really a pleasure to be here to really just have, I guess, more like a discussion around issues which I think very passionate to all of us, people who work in the areas of international and security issues, and people who are global citizens, people who are humanists, humanitarians, people who are concerned about any other human being out there. Over the past 20 plus years, I've got a chance to do research in many countries who are affected and step back and look at these issues. So I'm going to provide a general, I guess, run through the kind of work which I've done over the years. And in the process, I think we'll also get a chance to choose some of discussions and also go through some of the concepts, So as a start, I think, so there are some things that we're very familiar with, from media, wars, refugees, and so forth. And before 1989, I mean, most of the threat of war was, around the Cold War, and there the central concern or the primary concern was war between countries, the U.S. and this, that sort of thing. Since the fall of the Soviet Union, the transformation of, I guess, the Cold War, most of the wars that emerge are actually within countries. And that is really a fundamental shift in the way we understand security, global relations, and so forth. So when you look around the world, I mean, you see a variety of wars within countries, the American Civil War long ago, but essentially those sort of things. And in my work, I mean, and other people's work, but I tend to actually frame those things typically as two kinds, in 2 ways. One is what I call new wars, and the other one is what I call terrorism warfare. And by new wars, again, this is not a term that I coined or other people have used it before, but essentially what it really means is to talk of the new kinds of wars in which wars are not between or among countries. You have a declaration of war, you have regular militaries and so forth. So by new wars, really what they mean is a kind of new warfare that involves irregular, armies, civilians are targets, and so, and typically in those kinds of cases, civilians are the primary target, and the goal is really not to conquer a territory and take it and rule a country, but rather it is to, like capture another country, what I mean. But to give you examples, Yugoslavia, Rwanda, and Sierra Leone, and a whole bunch of other countries. So now new wars are mostly really, they are mostly really tied to domestic or local or national discontents. Now, terrorism warfare is slightly different. Terrorism warfare, so when I said, we're all familiar with the idea of terrorism, the war on terror. What I really mean by terrorism warfare is somehow the transformation of terrorism, not just as an incident, but actually as a continuous war practice. So if you go, for example, like Iraq, Afghanistan, there what you really see is that terror, that is the act of suicide bombings and those sort of things, has actually become part of war. And also the interveners, the United States and others, in a sense, they are part of that warfare. So what I mean by terrorism warfare is the kinds of wars in which terrorism is part of the way war is actually fought, be it whether you are from the war on terror side or whether you're from the, terrorist side. It's all a terrorism warfare. And I think to understand this insecurity, I think it is useful to really just, to understand the global dimensions with this. I wanted to share with some work that is done from the, it's called the Fragile State Index. And this is actually a work that is done by another organization. So I'll just share some few, let's see where's the stuff here? Okay, let me go back again. Okay, the Fragile State Index here. Let me just open it here. So the Fragile State Index is, it's like any kind of index, and it is primarily done, developed by the Fund for Peace. It's a fairly well-respected organization. And what they have done is that over the past decade or so, they have actually been putting like an index on countries on how stable or vulnerable they are to conflict. And one of the bad things is that all countries are becoming extremely vulnerable to conflict, including the United States. So, for example, you can see green and so forth. So, but what I really want to share here is just the methodology which they use and the indicators. So when they talk about fragile states, how do they really measure that? And I think this gives us a very good sense into what are the problems. So when we talk of wars and all those things, what are the issues? So they actually use these four primary indicators here: cohesion, economic indicators, political indicators, and social indicators. And you can go down the list. For each one of those, they have other variables. But what this actually does, it sets us to understand. So if you look into what are the causes of conflict, okay? Well, usually, I mean, there are questions of cohabitation among people of different groups, races, ethnicities, and so forth, economic injustices, political injustices, and social injustices. So these are the kinds of things that are, and each time a country somehow becomes weak in any one of these indicators, it becomes more at a risk for. And when you look at the places where there is war, typically you find big problems of cohesion, economic injustice, political injustice, and social injustice. So I just wanted to allow people to these. The UNHCR has some very interesting data, of course. I mean, so all of these wars, you can really, get a sense of them by just looking at the range of, the rate of what is called the global forced displaced population, the number of people who have actually been displaced. Because whether you have new wars or terrorism warfare, eventually, I mean, what it does, it displaces people. And you can see here how that population has been growing, over, for example, since 2010 to 9, so 2010 to 2020, you can see roughly now, I mean, we talk of like almost 80 million people, displaced, either as internally displaced or outside of their country, but essentially it's asylum seekers. All of these are like huge bodies of people. And the statistics and data is always, wonderful and good, but there's always a human thing to it. So when these wars happen, it's always somebody's life and somebody involved. And I always like to share the stories of people. One of them is a young fellow. He has become actually fairly popular now. His name is Ishmael B. He was a child who was involved in the war in Sierra Leone. So I'll just short video from him. I mean, you can hear himself speak. And then I'll also share the video from Malala, about Malala Yousafzai from Afghanistan. So the war in Sierra Leone was a very good example of new wars, while the war in Afghanistan is a very good example of what I call terrorism warfare. So let me just let this.
Being a child in the war, it's difficult, and I have no desire to really survive because I've lost everything. My name is Ishmael Bia. I am an author, and I'm also a human rights activist. By age 18, I've been recruited into the army, and I was fighting as a soldier. When the war finally came to my part of the country, I was 12 years old, and I started running from it. I lost everything. My immediate family was killed in the war, so my mother, father, and 2 brothers. You learned to function in madness very quickly. You have to adapt to your situation in order to survive. And often you're exposed to extreme levels of violence that you've never even heard of. There was a lot of hardship. We had lots of arms and ammunition, but no food, no medicine, lots of drugs. But also when you've lost family and everything, you quickly learn to belong to this group. But to belong to this new group required violence. Violence became the way to show loyalty. Well, there were several things that gave me hope. One of them was when I was a boy, my father used to say to me, if you're alive, there's a possibility that something good would happen to you. That if none of those possibilities exist in your life anymore, you will die. And while we had gone on one of these missions, there were a few people who showed up. And I vividly remember them wearing this thing that says UNICEF on it, and the logo of this person with this baby. And I remember thinking to myself the first time that maybe they're like a new mercenary group that I'm gonna like collaborate with. And I never heard of UNICEF. So they had some talk with the commander, and then at some point they lined everybody up, and then they would disarm us, and they took my weapon. I was not happy. I was actually very upset because I knew what that meant not to have a weapon in the context that I was in. And then they put us in this vehicle and said we're going to recover from the war and become a child again. They brought us to a place called Approved School, which became the center that I spent 8 months there recovering from the war. It's because of that intervention that took me out of that situation and made other things possible. After I came out of this experience of being a child in war, and I thought to myself, what can I do to give back? What can I do to help people understand the possibilities on the other hand, how you can recover from all of that when you're given the right kind of support. So I decided to be an example for both people coming out of the struggle, but also people who are doing that work to assist people coming out of that struggle. It's not often you come out of a situation, you meet somebody who has come out of a similar situation, and it's do it well and it's standing there. So it gives you hope that you too can do something yourself. For every child, hope.
So that's the story of Ishmael B. And most of us have also heard of Malala Yousafzai from Afghanistan. And this is just a little thing about her. I mean, it's not her voice herself, but I think.
After a girl who spoke out and was killed You're right.
Tonight, Malala remains in intensive care. She was shot in the head for daring to suggest girls should go to school.
I'm still 17. I'm still a teenager.
I don't know how to treat you. This is really bad.
Treat it.
Treat it.
I want people to learn from the experience I had. My father only gave me the name Malani. He didn't make me Malani. There's a moment when you have to choose whether to be silent or to stand up. The Taliban said that no girl can go to school, and if she goes, then we know what we can do. They shot me on the left side of my forehead. They thought it's a bullet would silence us.
Thought that she will survive.
But I am the same Malala. I tell my story not because it is unique. It is the story of many girls.
The Nobel Peace Prize is to be awarded to Malala Yousafzai.
We realize the importance of light when we see darkness, the importance of our voice when we are silenced. Let us pick up our books and our pens. They are our most powerful weapons.
Okay, so that's the story of Malala Yousafzai, and I think when you deal with discussions of wars and violence over time, at first you always begin to soak in the bad human feelings, the sorrows, and all those things. But over time, you also begin to understand that once in a while you have a good story, you have a good end. And I think that part of it is, in a sense, that's also what allows or enables some of us who do this work to still be there. So both Malala Yousafzai and Ismail B, I think they have gone through some of the most horrible experiences, but they have actually come out now. Millions of other people haven't actually get that chance. And I recall actually when I went to Sierra Leone to do research some years ago, I met with a group of young men who were actually child soldiers like Ismail B, and interviewed them for hours. But some of them have transformed. So anyway, so what are the big questions in through this work and this kind of problems of new wars and terrorism warfare that we deal with? So I think the big questions when you look at all of these things, the first question, of course, what are the roots of civil wars and terrorism warfare? What led to that? It's tempting to assume that these are a bunch of crazy people. They may be, but I think there's something much more deeper to the story. They may be acting crazy, but they haven't always been crazy, I guess, so to speak. And the other part of it, when in all of these wars, really, there are two, I guess, entities or parts. One is actually countries or states, and the other one is persons. So the question is, what is the interconnection between security and human security? And the two are not necessarily the same. We tend to assume that, well, if the country or the state is secure, but no, you can have actually human insecurity and actually have state security and so forth. So understanding the connection between state security and human security is actually very central to all of these debates. And and of course, the question is, how do countries and world powers respond to security challenges and the responsibility to protect vulnerable persons? So we know that when these things happen, wars, violence, countries respond, especially the world powers, United States and others. But how do they respond? Whose interest and in what ways? Those are like extremely complicated questions. And typically when they respond, they always say, well, we're there to protect the vulnerable people. So there's a responsibility to protect the vulnerable people, but the story becomes a little much more deeper. So, and of course, all of these responses to global issues, all of these things is part of, in a sense, what we call global society. Now, global society is a very complicated thing, but in recent years, it's some of these interconnections among persons and countries around the world that goes beyond trade, security, and a whole bunch of moral issues. But very recently, again, at least here in the United States and in Western Europe, I mean, the question of nativism has actually been emerging. And for me, this is actually a very interesting question in terms of how it relates to global society, because in a way, when you have too much nativism, global society actually becomes impossible, at least the way we knew it. And this is one very challenging and problematic trend that is actually happening. I'm not really too sure how far it's going to go, but certainly it is a question that it's important for understanding the nature of global society. So to begin to tap into these questions, again, in my work and the work of other people, there are some core ideas. So when you go through those questions, there are some core concept ideas, theories that have evolved or emerged. And these are mostly around questions of human rights, or what in the US we call civil rights. But what are the rights of people? So first and foremost, we know that the right to life. Every human being actually has a right to life. Well, when war actually happens or when terrorism warfare happens, the first thing that is really taken away as a right is the right to life, because it means you can actually be, your life can be taken away anytime. So and then of course a bunch of other kinds of rights, touch on all those things. But human rights becomes a very central kind of concept. So when countries say, well, we need to intervene here, part of it is say, well, we say, well, we cannot really stand and watch all these violations of rights of people, right? And along with that is the question of human security. So human rights are mostly, before terrorism warfare, mostly was kind of like oppressive states, regimes, violating some kind of like rights of people, like putting people in prison and so forth. But it wasn't so much about mass killing of people, but with the emergence of terrorism warfare, and now we begin to talk of human security, when I mean the lives of hundreds of thousands of people are actually at stake. And again, as we saw in Yugoslavia, the genocide, in Rwanda, nearly 800,000 people killed in a very short time. And in between there, of course, varying other kinds of wars, Iraq and Afghanistan, and so forth. So the question of human security actually becomes extremely important. Again, in the earlier forms of warfare, when you have war among countries, among established militaries, again, I don't want to imply that it is okay when military people die, but somehow it's different. When military people get killed in war, I guess it is something for which they have trained and prepared to some degree. They don't go there to be killed, but at least it is part of their, I guess, preparedness, so to speak. That is not the case for civilians. Civilians are generally not, so, and because new wars and terrorism warfare actually targets civilians, and when you have this mass casualty of civilian death, it becomes something extremely important. And the other thing too, in all of this terrorism warfare, more civilians actually died than the actual fighters. The fighters died, but not so much compared to the civilian population. Yeah? And the other concept is the concept of state security. So in all of these warfare, somehow it is about who controls the state and the government. Okay? And what you begin to see is the divergence between the interests of those in power, controlling the state, the government, and the vast majority of the people. So for example, when you look at either new wars or terrorism warfare, it is a fight to control the government, control the state, right? And those who control the state at the moment, I mean, they consider security in terms of actually preventing that from happening. So the question of state security becomes another interesting concept. And the issue of democracy, again, by democracy, I really don't mean here just quick elections, vote more, that's that's really not the essence of democracy. I mean, that is just part of what democracy is. But the essence of democracy really is understand the relation between the people and the rulers, and to understand that in terms of the rights that they have, and also their say in how they are governed and the representation. So democracy becomes a far much more complicated concept beyond just elections and voting and political parties. It is really at the core of it is really whether people actually have a meaningful say in how they're governed, whether they actually feel represented by whatever kind of system that is there. But these are like the kinds of questions. And too often what we see around the world is actually that countries or places where they are democratic by mechanisms are really not democratic in essence. And there's a whole bunch of countries that even fall in that categories. And ultimately, the question of governance. So governance is slightly different from the question of democracy or elections and so forth. So governance really comes to the management of the affairs of the state by the elite or by the leaders. And that really comes down to typically questions of corruption, questions of efficiency. When you have poor governance, when you have anti-democratic or anti-inclusive kind of systems, it generates the kinds of grievances which typically leads to warfare, be it new wars or terrorism warfare. And that then, of course, creates the varying forms of state and human insecurities. Okay? So these are like concepts that are, very often we see in the literature there. And let's see here. Okay. So in my own, I'm going to actually address this concept in, I guess, in two chunks. The first one is the question of human rights, human security, and state security. And this is actually things that I have done in my own works, in my books, and articles that I've worked. So this is really just going to be some very high level kind of discussion of those things. But generally, I mean, these three issues of human rights, human security, and state security, there are a lot of other things that are implicit in there. And the first and foremost question is citizenship. And by citizenship, I really don't mean paper citizenship. Whether you have a paper that says you're a citizen of this country or not, it is way more than that. One of the easiest ways, I guess, to begin to think of the idea of citizenship is to think of it as membership. If you live in a country, are you a member? And if you're a member, are you a full member? And if so, what is the extent of your membership? And typically, what that really means, citizenship is a relation of rights and obligations. So we know all the obligations. So the state always, of course, enforces the obligations. They collect taxes from people in countries where they collect taxes. But if they don't, they force with the conscription. I mean, there's always a way in which the state actually, extract things from the people. So the obligations. And it is true that if you're part of a country, I mean, you have some obligations, to contribute to the collective good. But what about your rights? So if you are, in a country in which your humanity or your rights are actually very minimal, in a sense, really it means your citizenship is actually very small, or maybe non-existent. So to give you some historical cases, in the United States, I mean, before the 14th Amendment, or when you have slavery here, I mean, you have a whole bunch of people here who are not citizens. They're human beings, but the system of oppression actually denied their humanity. Now, it doesn't have to be slavery for us to see again these limitations of citizenship, but essentially, whenever the human rights and civil rights of people, their dignity of a significant categories of persons are beginning to be denied, then we talk of actually erosion of citizenship. And once you have that kind of settings, it creates grievances. Now, it's one thing to say, okay, well, the right of that person, this person is denied, but when you have a whole category of persons, be it based on race, be it based on religion or ethnicity, then you begin to generate grievances. And so when you go back to wars and and terrorism warfare, mostly it is these grievances around the question of whether your humanity and your dignity as a person and as a group of people is accepted or not. And the less accepted your humanity and the people that you belong to is, it means the less rights you will be accorded, or your rights will not be respected. It means people, you or people of your kind can be easily thrown into jail without really good reason. It means people of your kind can actually be discriminated against. It means you'll be denied from resources. You will not have the right to have a state government, and the people who run the government do not really look or represent you. So this is really what I mean. The questions on citizenship, and it lingers on these human rights and civil rights, including civil, political, social, and economic rights. And there's a wide range of citizenship, but at a minimum, we talk of civil and political rights. Okay? And by civil rights, we mean respecting your natural rights, right to freedom of conscience, freedom of religion, those sort of things, and by political rights having a say in how your state is governed at a minimum to the right to vote and also be voted into office. Then, of course, through that you can go through. So this is one chunk of the issue when we talk of human rights in particular. Now, the other thing, again, that I and many other people have addressed in our work is wars, new wars, and terrorism. And here the key thing really here is what we call the civilian victims of displacement, ethnic cleansing, genocide, torture, and so forth. Okay? And I think you have to understand really, so I don't want to really call it the evolution of war, because, but in the early 1800s, in Europe and many parts, primarily in Europe, I mean, wars actually used to be, before the Geneva Convention and other kinds of regulations, war used to be, I guess, total violence. Yeah, if this group or that and that group or this country and that country have, going to war, you can surprise them, you can kill everything, you can destroy. There were no rules of war. Those things actually began to change as countries, with the international system, eventually with the, with the Geneva Conventions, where, I mean, warfare was actually regulated through some kind of, I guess, moralistic and humanistic rules. Okay, well, hey, we understand that people fight, but when you fight, you have to have a uniform, you have to be an army. I mean, you cannot kill the women and the children, you cannot destroy, those sort of things. So, and this led to the concept of, war crimes and all those things. Now, this worked very well, again, because most of the wars were considered to be wars between countries. But once warfare begins to move from countries to within countries, and you have militias or the people who actually fight are not really established militaries, well, the first thing, they didn't sign the Geneva Convention, they didn't sign nothing. Or when you have terrorists, like somebody who is angered by some political and economic injustice that somehow wants to revenge that in a way that either rational or irrational. Well, those people actually do not, so for them, warfare doesn't involve none of those quote unquote civilized rules of war. Okay? And so this is where the displacement of human beings, genocide, ethnic cleansing, all of these things actually happens mostly within that kind of context, because in a sense, war is not regulated. And it really, you cannot really regulate a war when you don't have state entities. So we talk of non-state actors. So I hate to call it the evolution of war, but somehow war has actually moved from this kill everything. Okay, well, let's fight under I guess the rules of the Geneva Convention, and then it has somehow degraded again into kind of like total war. Within this, again, as I said before, they caution them so we begin to see the juxtaposition of state security and the question of human security. So when we talk of state security here, so that you have the state primarily, in the form of the government, of the system of authority that actually have control of, significant control within the country, a recognized national territory, borders, and a government that the international community recognizes. So all of these things really is a matter of recognition. So if you have a country here, its borders are recognized by the international community, meaning the United Nations and other powers, and their neighbors. Then you have a government there, whether it's a democracy or not, but other countries recognize that these are the, so that is what we mean. So those become the representative of the state in a sense. Okay, but when you look at states or countries, there are different kinds. So I showed you before the failed state index, okay? And think of really countries as healthy or sick. Okay, a healthy country is one robust, orderly, not much violence, high crimes. I mean, like everybody good, sound economy, well-being, human well-being, so all the good things that we think of, like social well-being, good, political freedoms, good. People are safe in terms of their life and property and so forth. So that's fairly healthy country. And if you look at this failed state index, you will see some of the countries at the very top of the index, like mostly Scandinavian countries, and very recently now another dimension is environmental issues, because again, now this is not so much about the state, but the country of itself. But when you have severe adverse environmental issues, so all of that undermined. So you have this kind of like healthy country or healthy state, and then you can go to the sickest ones, so to speak, one in which high poverty, high levels of violence, instabilities, and so forth. And this is typically the places where there's war, and on this continuum in my work, so when in recent literature, I mean, a lot of people talk of failed state, and by failed state, what they mean is countries in which, like, so think of like actually Afghanistan, for a very long time, but I mean even before 9/11. So it's a country, it's countries that are recognized, but somehow there's no one single authority that actually have control, and the state has actually somehow failed. In other words, it's not able to meet the basic responsibilities of providing security and minimal well-being for its citizens. And then eventually, of course, you have state collapse when, I mean, okay, well, the state has just collapsed. Somalia for a very long time. But in my work, I write about a state decay. And for me, state decay is actually the process through which you understand how a country really moves from being, okay, a regular country, maybe not so healthy, but, kind of like, it's okay, to actually being a failed state and also eventually a collapsed state. And state decay really is a process through which the state increasingly becomes unable to meet its basic responsibilities of political, economic, and social response towards its citizens. And usually it is propelled by things like authoritarianism, corruption, but it's a kind of thing that increasingly actually makes the citizens, so to speak, angry, unhappy, and increasingly more and more people. And when you have that kind of situation, state decay, typically you have two things either emerge. It's either A, you have a transformation of the state through some kind of mostly civil and a civil society driven approaches, or you have actually war. So if you go back to the fall of the Soviet Union, communism in Eastern Europe, Bulgaria, Hungary, and all those countries, most of these were actually able to transform in a largely non-violent way into, well, I don't know whether it's better countries or not, but certainly, I mean, they were able to move from that, system to, but it has, so if you considered, those regimes at the point that's been at the point of like, I guess, sick in some ways, then that was a kind of like a non-violent way of transformation. Now, in some other contexts, when you have state decay, the countries are not able to transform through a peaceful process, then it leads actually into conditions of civil war. And one thing that I have actually observed in my work, in most cases, very often, multi-party democracy is often presented as a way to actually deal with state decay, but too often actually it is done wrongly, and it actually leads countries from state decay into civil war. That was the case largely in Sierra Leone, in Liberia, in Cote d'Ivoire. So, but I will leave that, and maybe we can come back to those things later on. So this is the I guess the continuum or the trajectory of the state. Okay? Now, once a state gets into a state collapse situation, the question then becomes, how do you respond? And typically in that case, of course, you begin to have human insecurity. Like, vast majority of people become insecure, their life and so forth. And in the international community, what happens in the debate, then, what do we do about that situation, right? And in the late 90s, after the war in Yugoslavia, the failure of the international community intervening in Yugoslavia and Rwanda, there was actually a very interesting push by late UN Secretary General Kofi Annan and others to advocate for a very strong, robust kind of international intervention in countries where the state is actually not able to protect its citizens. Now, before that, the idea of the state or countries in the world, the principle that governed international relations were mostly the idea of sovereignty. It means that every country is sovereign, kind of like other countries cannot just go and do things in there without its consent. So the principle of sovereignty, state sovereignty, was actually very much the pillar of international relations. Again, there are violations here and there, but generally, with the wars, with the genocide in Yugoslavia and Rwanda, Kofi Annan and others actually pushed this idea that, well, sovereignty doesn't actually just mean state sovereignty, but you can also think of sovereignty of the people, that is, people who live in a given country, and the global community actually has a responsibility towards those people. So, so it is called R2P, for short, responsibility to protect. And in a very simplified way, it means the idea is that if the international community sees that a state or a government is not able to protect its citizens because there's another force or entity within the country that is actually challenging its authority, then there's a responsibility for the international community to actually intervene and quote unquote provide protection for those people. And it's under that principle, again, there is a UN Charter, Chapter 7 and other things, where that countries say, okay, well, we have to intervene. So in Sierra Leone, for example, the international community intervened based on the principles, and sometimes it works. The problem with intervention is that too often the countries or the powers that intervene, be they regional or global powers, too often they have many kind of interests, and sometimes they are contradictory interests. And this is one of the things that I address in my particular work. And I make a distinction between interventions where the primary driver of the intervention is really benevolent humanitarianism, that is the primary interest is to really the protection of the people, or the primary interest of the intervention is really for the benefit or the security of the intervening countries. So, for example, when the United States intervened in Iraq, the primary reason really, at least as we were told, is to ensure the security of the United States. Okay? That is to deal with terrorism and so forth. And the same thing with Afghanistan. Well, that is really that's a kind of different rationale and interest as compared to say, well, we just want to go and help the Iraqi people. But to me, I mean, it seems that each time you have interventions that are more driven by the interest of the intervening powers, too often what you really end up having is actually the intervention becomes illegitimate or not accepted, and it leads to this part to what I call domestic resistance and taking the form of terrorism warfare. Now, in cases where the interventions are mostly driven primarily by purely humanitarian things, especially in smaller countries, it tends to work by restoring, stability, peace in those parts. Sierra Leone, for example, is a very good example of that. Now, it takes a lot to rebuild countries, but at a minimum, restoring minimal levels of stability and then allow so that the countries can begin to say, well, how do we rebuild back? So these are the kinds of tensions that I actually address in my work. So in a way, I mean, if you think of ungoverned spaces or spots in the world that are really not, I guess, under quote unquote international order, countries that have collapsed, the question then really is whether you're going to have intervention, driven by geopolitical factors, or you're going to really purely humanitarian things. So I talk of new humanitarianism in my work, and I contrast that with actually terrorism warfare and the war on terror. Yeah? Since the war on terror, we have learned a lot. The United States in particular, we have learned that actually you cannot really have total war. You can have, I guess more like special forces kind of things, and that's what the U.S. is doing mostly in African countries. We just saw the withdrawal from Afghanistan. But anyway, hopefully we can come back to those things. So this is the one part of it. The other part of it is the democracy and governance part of it. And this again are things that I address in my work. And in a way, this is really, so if you want to think of like where war comes from and how do you solve war, or I guess how do you solve or prevent wars, this is really what we have to do, is democracy and governance. Because new wars, terrorism warfare, and all of those things are byproduct of actually, problems of governance, and governance both locally within countries, but also in terms of international relations. That is when you do have unjust international systems. So in the works on democracy and governance, there's a lot of, most of it really is driven by neoliberal kind of like thinking or politics again. There's some merit to it. I have some questions about it, but largely, I mean, it revolves on this idea of like neoliberal way of thinking of the relation between people in countries. And it is largely really drawn from the experiences of Western countries, that is primarily Western Europe and the United States, while democracy has worked for a very long time until fairly recently in this part of the world. I mean, it is true that since the it's in the 1800s onwards, there has been democracy and it has worked. But whether that actually easily translates into other countries, it's a little bit kind of complicated, especially through the mechanisms of multi-party democracy. So, but when I think of democracy, and I address this primarily in the case of Nigeria. So, I think the most fundamental ways really to think of democracy is through the idea of representation and freedom. Okay? And if I say, we have a government here, and we accept the government or not, we are more likely to accept the government if two things. One, the government really, allows us to be, free people in many ways. And number two, if the government really represents our interest. But this is the tricky part of it. What is representation? So the way democracy actually evolved in most of the Western world, largely, again, a lot of generalization here, but essentially it was the idea that actually through the mechanism of voting, you as a person can actually be represented in your government. So you vote, and it worked in part because most of the Western countries were not really, they had diversities, but they were not really mostly racially diverse or ethnically diverse. Most of them like ideological and class kind of inequalities. And those are like things, people can move, people can switch and so forth. Those are not permanent divisions among people. So the idea of representation in context where the differences among people are not really, I guess, are not innate. That's quite different from countries where you have differences among people that are really difficult to bridge. And most of the countries that we see new wars, especially in Africa, these are countries that are highly diverse in terms of like ethnic different cultures. So, for example, in the United States, increasingly we've become more diverse. Now it's a majority non-white population, right? So if you think of when we had an 80%, 90% white population, the other 20%, okay, well, for actually up to the 1960s, really African Americans had barely rights. I mean, because Jim Crow and all the Civil Rights, the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act were in the 60s. Okay? But when you have a very big, powerful majority group, what it does is simply oppresses the minority group, and it doesn't really lead to disorder in a way. It manifests injustice, but it doesn't necessarily lead to disorder because the resistance is weak. But when you actually have cases where the other groups are fairly big or they can resist, then it changes. And this is really what we see in the United States. Now, we have a country in which the non-white population is, about half or so of the population. So you can see the question of representation becomes much more complicated. This thing that is emerging in the United States is actually what has been going on in African countries ever since, and many other countries, by the way. So representation here is how do you really understand representation in terms of whether a category of persons, racial groups, ethnic groups, religious groups are they represented. So when you hear, for example, like the war in Iraq, trying to build democracy in Iraq, well, we talk of like Shia and Sunni, and Kurds. So anything to talk about representation means you have to have a government that actually represents those two entities there. So this makes multi-party democracy a little much more complicated because you cannot really achieve that simply by going to elections and say, well, any person who wins 50 plus 1 wins. No, it doesn't mean that. So this is one question that I address in Nigeria, and ultimately, of course, I think I realize the values of liberal democracy, the idea of individual rights and so forth. But somehow the question is always how do you modify that, or how do you make that work in much more diverse settings? And I think in some of my other works, I talk of institutional designs. That is, what kind of arrangement you can create to ensure that you have much more diversity among persons. And the other part of the governance part of it again, so whenever you have governments that are really not representative of the people, by however way you measure it. Typically, what they do is that they tend to actually take leadership that is actually irresponsive to the people. And I don't know whether the guys are good guys or bad guys, but as a human beings, but once you actually become, you're not held accountable, or that you're not responsible, it opens the room for people to actually do all kinds of crazy things, corruption, thinking that they have absolute power. But generally, I mean, governance becomes complicated, and typically we fall into what is called poor governance, bad governance. And what that means is systems in which you have a ruling elites that are corrupt, and by corrupt, they take big bribes, they take state funds, they use it for personal things, and they do nepotism, they favor people of their own kind in the military, in distribution of resources. So it creates these kinds of grievances. So governance then becomes a critical question. And so the more you weave towards what is called good governance, and good governance means recognizing the rights of people, inclusive, ethical leadership, and so forth, the less a country is likely to fall into state collapse or state decay. And the more you weave from it, the more you're likely to actually fall into state decay and state collapse. So the governance becomes a critical question. And in the 1990s onwards, governance was tied to democracy from the World Bank and the IMF, and especially in African countries. More recently, I mean, people have begun to disassociate the two a little bit, because they understand that governance is more than just about elections, especially in this context. So there's a whole kind of this works and policies about inculcating the kind of citizenry that is able to hold their leaders accountable and be vigilant, and also the kinds of leadership that actually is responsive to the people. So. For these multinational institutions, so the international community is very critical. So especially in poor developing countries, because most of those countries are highly dependent on international institutions for loans and other kinds of things, or aid. And what you find here is the way, again, international institutions are used in terms of getting policy outcomes. So, before the rise of nativism in the United States and Western Europe, there was this kind of global interest in global citizenship or global communities to promote neoliberalism in various parts of the world, promote democratic values, and so forth. So again, it doesn't really always work very well, but at a minimum, it shows that in the global system, there's this actually engagement in the affairs of other countries by way of holding governments accountable to some quote unquote universal norms, but also by checking in for the well-being of ordinary people. My concern is what happens when because of domestic problems in the Western world, Western countries themselves begin to actually, find themselves not to be in a position where they can actually, quote unquote, provide this moral and ethical leadership around the world. To give a very good case in point, I mean, the United States foreign policy for a very long time has been tied around questions of human rights, democracy, and so forth. While all of that went off the window, I mean, after over the past 4 or 5 years, the US can barely talk about democracy or corruption to any other country in the world because of what we have seen here, the erosion of democracy, the erosion of ethical leadership. I think it's fair to say that, the problem really didn't start with Trump, but certainly, the Trump presidency, as we all know, it's really, it's really a crystal manifestation of the risk that the United States actually face in terms of its own democracy. Now, the problems may not come from there, but certainly it is. So, but the point we really want to put across here is that when you have these kinds of problems in quote unquote the global powers in the world, it undermines their position across the world. So even when they want to do benevolence, even when they really want to promote this genuine human rights or governance issues, it makes it difficult. So one of the things that there's almost a kind of like a global vacuum. And I know we have a pandemic, COVID, and all that, but you can see that really there's almost like a global vacuum. I mean, there are different kind of entities that are actually vying for China and so forth. But I think what this really has in terms of understanding global security and the lives of vulnerable people is that the more you actually have this global vacuum in terms of the countries that are able and credibly speak to these issues, the more you actually have the chances or the propensity for breeding of poor governance violations around the world. Now, hopefully, I mean, other countries again have their own domestic issues, and again, this is to just wrap it up here. I mean, this is what is now leading me to again what I'm actually beginning to think about what I call localized security. And the question really here is, as all these various countries in the world are dealing with their own domestic security issues, which creates human security issues, but also potentially regional and global issues. And then you have this global vacuum, and but also you have this global interest. Is what is going to be the intersection between these global interests and global norms and localized or local kind of conflict. So this is a terrain where I am, I guess, beginning to head. And the question, again, I don't really have answers to these things for now, but certainly the question is really how do can we? So if there's a global vacuum, or if there is, I guess, weakness in the global system, what are the I guess what are the opportunities to begin to think of more local solutions? Can local solutions in countries actually lead to democratic countries, or they may just end up actually having countries that are peaceful, but really not necessarily, I guess, the ones that actually, ensures the human rights of the vast majority of people. So these are like open questions, but I'll leave it for here so that we can maybe have like one or two kind of questions. But overall, I think the spectrum of understanding the nature of insecurity, the causes of it, or the roots, and the global and regional responses, I think somehow hinges on these kind of terms and concepts. So I'll leave it here for now. Thank you very much.
Right now that is a functioning democracy 100% across the board, or is that just like unattainable, just not really reality?
So so there really are two things. There's the technical definitions of democracy, which is free, fair elections, the minimum, and there's really the ideals of democracy, and that is really the extent to which freedoms, freedom, social justice, and those things are met. So the failed state index, what it actually shows that some countries have actually gone down, and the United States is a very good example of that. So when I was in grad school, when we were taught about democracy, the kind of like colloquial definition was countries in which democracy is the only game in town. And the United States was always given as an example because the idea was that in the United States, you cannot imagine anything other than democracy. I don't think really that is true now, but to your question, I think I will say the countries that rise up, that are top at the global, the failed state index, are much better democracies. And most of those countries, they are really Scandinavian countries. I should really also note that their context is different. Fairly small European countries that has accumulated some kind of wealth over years and not very diverse. Their challenges is not the same as actually highly diverse countries. Race and racism, or it really messes up politics. So I guess are there democratic countries in the world? Yes, there's a lot. There are. I mean, are there vulnerabilities? Absolutely. One of the things that you also to notice that nearly all countries in the world are becoming more and more diverse. And if you actually look at the population composition of European countries, all of them, by the way, European countries that used to be like 95% of one people in the 70s. Now those countries actually have like significant minorities, like 10%, 5%. Countries like Denmark, Sweden, now they really have significant non-European minorities. So again, they are not at the point like the United States, but certainly I mean, those things raise this question of representation. I guess that's the best way to think of it. I mean, there are democracies for sure, but I think every democracy really has a risk. And I think what we have seen in the United States, I mean, there's still a lot for us to learn, but the last election, we only get a change of power because we had about 20,000 National Guard troops sitting by the Congress to ensure that the process go through. That is really not normal democracy works. Normal democracy works like, you don't need to, those are the kinds of things that you see in developing countries, like literally where the military has to come out to make sure it happens. So to me, that's not a good sign. Now, hopefully this is the last time it happens. It doesn't happen anytime soon. But I think it wasn't a good sign.
In your of deteriorating state, do you sense that there, or have you found any evidence that there is an impact on the timing of intervention or the types of intervention that make it more effective?
So two questions about the timing and the nature of intervention, and then what makes it, whether it's effective or not. So those are two different things. The timing of interventions really is a geopolitical kind of issue. Interventions happens in countries when one or more either global power or regional power really have a very vested interest in that place. And that interest can either be a moral one or historical one or economic. When you have those kinds of things, that is when interventions happen. Whether for good or so, for example, like in Sierra Leone, intervention happened because for some reason Nigeria, which was a regional power, was very much interested in what was going on in Sierra Leone. And then eventually Britain through Tony Blair became very interested. So typically interventions happens when you do have either a global power or a regional power becomes very interested. If you don't, I guess if somebody doesn't take interest, somebody I guess that is some entity that is able doesn't take interest, it will just keep on going on. Now, what makes it successful? That's a different question. So there are some successful interventions. I will say the interventions in Liberia and Sierra Leone are successful. Cambodia. In most cases, I think interventions are more successful in countries that tend to be smaller. When I mean it's the international community can muster in overwhelming kind of like resources. It tends to be much more. Certainly, it tends to be much more successful when a significant or vast majority of people actually wants the intervention. So if you're intervening against the will of, I'm not talking about the government now, but the masses. When the masses, most of them want it, it tends to be more, so it shows a convergence between the interest of the local people or the masses and the rationale. So it tends to be much more successful in places where there are smaller countries, and also when intervention is largely driven by more benevolent or humanitarian kind of reasons, and when the masses want it. When the opposite happens, when you have interventions in fairly big countries, or where the masses or a significant chunk of the population don't want it, typically you end up having resistance, and that's really what happens in Iraq. Iraq is a poster child for intervention when A, it's not a small country, but B, a significant portion of the people didn't like Saddam Hussein, but they didn't want the US either. And you see what happens. So going by recent histories, in most cases, really, interventions typically have, in many cases, they are not very timely. or enough, or that is sufficient in terms of international commitment, force, material support, and also scope. A very good example is Somalia. Somalia has been actually been in that state for more than 20 years now, and there's intervention there, but the intervention has really never done much because it is not strong enough. Because most of the intervention is actually done by the African Union, African forces, which are really not very strong, and the African Union itself doesn't have much of the resources. So you see that it really lingers on and on. But I think those are like some, the best forms of intervention really is when you intervene before you have state collapse, or when you, at the point of state decay. That is the best place to really have some of these things solved. Yeah. So I did wrote an article, I think it was published in 2006 or so, somewhere around that time. And it is published in Africa Today at Indiana University Press. And that's I started using it there. And we have a book that is currently under review, and we have developed that concept much further. So before that, I mean, there's a lot of actually works. So the humanitarianism, I mean, was a concept in the international security literature and moralistic philosophy. So there's a lot of that concept there. I don't really know whether I cannot really say I'm the first person to actually use that word, but certainly before that article, it wasn't a very common word in the literature. So even if there were some few here and there, there was a new words. The term new words was actually used, and Caldo was one of the person that actually very much associated with the term new wars. But new humanitarianism, I think, if there were, I think there were very few people. But essentially, what I really meant was, in contrast to actually other forms of intervention, this is the earlier form of international interventions was based on the principle of actually respecting the sovereignty of a country. That is to say, when you intervene, the country that you intervene in has to agree, those sort of things. And by new humanitarianism, what I meant was interventions that were driven largely by the doctrine of R2P, that is responsible to protect UN. I mean, countries use in a UN Chapter 7 mandate to intervene, even when the government doesn't want it. But in a way, it is largely really driven by the effort to protect human security. And in most cases, they are willing to somehow to, I guess, ignore or violate old ideas of state sovereignty and emphasize more on the sovereignty of the people. And by new humanitarianism, also what I meant is that it is more than just intervening to stop the war, but when the war ends, there has to be some kind of commitment or effort to actually address the root causes of war, and this is where you go into state building, so or international state building, which or post-war reconstruction, as I call it in some other works.
Thank you very much.
Well,
This
thank
is
you
going to
very
give
much.
us lots to think about.
Thank you very much. Yeah.